To address the issue this afternoon, we do have two eminent diplomats. We have Patricia Flohr, who is now the EU Special Representative to Central Asia. I mean, she had an extensive experience dealing with Central Asia, and in particular, or more generally, the post-Soviet world. She has been ambassador to Georgia. She was, before being appointed Special Representative of the EU, Germany's Special Envoy for Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia since March 2001. And she has been, as I said earlier, ambassador in Georgia, but also worked in Kazakhstan. On the US side, although this is not a box game, we have Mrs. Lynn Tracy, who is currently the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Central Asia in the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs. Her last assignment was Director for Central Asia in the NSC. I mean, she too has a very, very intensive knowledge of Central Asia. She's been posted in Ashgabat, she's been posted in Astana, as well as Peshawar, Bishkek, and Kabul. So with these two eminent persons, I'm sure we'll have a very, very interesting session. Let me perhaps say a few words about the previous session, just to give our two speakers some element of context. I won't summarize what has been said. Let's say that the general impression, and please, since all the speakers are still here, correct me if I'm wrong, is one of basic strategic convergence, but which has the utmost difficulty to be defined beyond 2014 and the withdrawal from Afghanistan. This is not to say that interests do not exist. It is not to say that opportunities do not exist, but it seems to be difficult for both the EU and the US to articulate it into an integrated strategy. I mean, let aside to work coherently together on these issues. I mean, this is just some of the preliminary thoughts that I'd like to throw up in this discussion before you correct me, of course, and say that, yes, you do indeed have a very integrated strategy for post-2014 and beyond, and that's what we'll see in a minute. Ambassador Flohr, the floor is yours, precisely.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to participate today in this panel. I'm sure you're aware that we have had a similar discussion already in Brussels with the Brussels crowd of experts. And so I'm happy today to be here and move that to the transatlantic plane in a sense. And I will actually start looking first of all a little bit at the EU interests in the Central Asia region. And also, of course, with some hints where I do see them coinciding actually with the US interests. Then explaining a little bit what that then means in terms of the concrete policies, the programs and the tools that the EU uses in the Central Asia region. And lastly, then also looking a little bit at the role of other players in the region, because while I still do think that the transatlantic link is an essential one, also in that region, but of course there are others active and with whom we also cooperate. Now, first of all, I have to acknowledge that the EU, in a sense, was a latecomer to Central Asia. Meaning that really, if I look back to the 90s and the first decade after independence, there was not a lot of EU engagement. That changed in 2007 when the EU then adopted the EU Central Asia strategy, and thus defined the framework of its own policies towards the region. Now, today, when I look at what the EU interests actually are in Central Asia, I would like to highlight, first of all, that Central Asia and the Central Asian states are the neighbors of our neighbors. So there is a certain geographic proximity. It's not immediate, but it is still very concrete, because it actually means that both in terms of the positive opportunities of the region, as well as in terms of the transnational threats, whatever comes from Central Asia or through Central Asia then also easily reaches the EU member states and territories. And that it could be on the positive side, of course, trade or energy resources, but it can also be drugs or refugees or migrants, so it includes all of that. That geographic, that relative geographic proximity is something, by the way, which distinguishes us from the US, in the sense that it actually means that that will not change. It will not be changed by post-2014. So it means that in some sense, the EU commitment to work with that region is actually a commitment to remain, because the issues also will remain on the agenda. Now, talking about neighbors of our neighbors, that also means that in some sense the EU Central Asia strategy has looked at our own European experience in terms of what we are actually trying to achieve in our neighborhood. And the core interests of the EU have always been that we do want to ensure stability, prosperity, and peace in our neighborhood. And that actually demands that we remain true to our own principles. Because long-term stability, it demands from our experience rule of law. It demands human rights, minority rights, political participation, moving towards democracy, and all of that. And it's part and parcel of a stability-oriented approach, but one that has a long-term sustainability. But of course, it also demands economic development, and it demands regional cooperation. It demands more interaction actually with the region. And so this has been the EU experience as such, but also the experience of EU enlargement, and it is part of our policies towards the Eastern neighborhood, which in fact, of course, is also part of the post-Soviet sphere. And some of these elements and some of these tools we are also trying to then use in Central Asia with our Central Asian partners. Now, of course, Central Asia also is of interest to the EU because it is actually a region with a big potential in terms of economic development, in terms of energy resources, and it is, after all, also a bridge between the rest of Asia, South Asia, China, and Europe. So if one looks at the region, one can easily imagine that there is a big potential in terms of trade, in terms of economic interaction. So therefore, that is another, of course, asset that the region has. Now, when the EU Central Asia strategy, which also embodied all of these thoughts in 2007, was reviewed in 2012, it was actually reaffirmed, but at the time the EU Foreign Affairs Council, the EU foreign ministers, decided that it actually merited an additional dimension. So the dimension that was added was the security sphere. And that reflected, of course, the acknowledgement that with 2014, with Afghanistan being a neighbor to Central Asia, that the EU also needed to take into account the overall security environment within which Central Asia finds itself. And I should highlight that when we look at Central Asia and the linkage with Afghanistan, that we actually tend to look at the positive opportunities in the region. In the sense that one can easily understand that for Central Asians, landlocked, therefore without an easy access to the seas, traditionally for historic reasons being oriented towards the north, towards Moscow, and actually being separated from South Asia, for them it actually would make eminent sense to now reconnect to South Asia to get access to the ports of Pakistan or other neighbors in the south, and to also leverage some of the economic potential which exists. And so therefore, potentially, one can see that as part of the stabilization efforts around Afghanistan through the Heart of Asia process, the Istanbul process, that actually there can be a positive contribution to be made by Central Asian countries, and they could also benefit from the overall stabilization of that region. So it's a win-win situation, actually, as we see it. I know that not everyone in the region defines it the same way, but this is our outlook, and that would be our vision for how we want to develop regional cooperation, also then between Central Asia and Afghanistan. Now, since the EU created its strategy in 2007, a number of programs have been active, and I would now claim that the EU is well established as a player, which it was not 10 years ago. And I'll give you a few examples. Now, first of all, the EU created EU delegations, embassies in the region. So we now have them in 4 of the 5 Central Asian countries. In Ashgabat, there is a liaison office, but also the political decision has already been made that, of course, it also should become over time a full-fledged delegation. And we have established a number of cooperation mechanisms. Among them is the yearly ministerial meeting between the foreign ministers of all 5 Central Asian states and the European side, represented either through the High Representative, which was the case last year, or through the presidency, meaning the foreign minister at that moment in the presidency seat of the EU. By the way, last year, in order to also highlight the EU commitment to the region, the High Representative for Foreign Policy and Security Issues, Cathy Ashton, she visited the region. She chaired herself the ministerial meeting in Bishkek and then traveled to Dushanbe, Tashkent, and Astana in addition. And so that also was meant to signal that we are engaged for the long term, and we do acknowledge also the specific role that the region has to play in today's world. I told you that the revision ended by adding a security dimension. What does that mean? The security dimension will lead to a high-level security dialogue, another institutionalized way of actually meeting all the 5 Central Asians. So once a year, we want to come together to look at the security-related issues, and on the agenda will be questions like, Afghanistan, what are the scenarios, what are the priorities for action? Could we define actually common projects or programs to be agreed upon? But among the issues to be discussed will also be, drug trafficking, border security, and other security-related issues in the region. So by and large, we have created an institutionalized political dialogue between the EU and the Central Asian governments, and we actually have done it at the regional level. I'm highlighting this because I happen to be here for the last 5 minutes or so of your previous panel, and so I heard that somebody was saying that we are all doing it bilaterally. No, that's not the case. The EU has taken care to actually, have the ministerials, the high-level security dialogue, but also 3 regional platforms at the regional level, where we actually bring all the 5 Central Asian states together in order to discuss certain issues. So in addition to the ministerial, the high-level security dialogue, I would like to mention the platform for rule of law, key issue for us and also for them, although they might not agree as to how we define it. Then the other platform is on education, and the third platform is on water and the environment. Again, a crucial issue for the overall region, where we do not see that you can find solutions within the national borders. Water management, energy issues in the region need regional responses, and therefore they need to be addressed also at the regional level. Now, among the other programs that are running in the region and that reflect the EU priorities, there are programs on rural development, economic development. There are programs on energy, on education, on water management, rule of law, human rights, reforms of the judiciary, another very important area also to us. So it's really a comprehensive approach, and it has actually a vision of supporting the transformation of these states based on the values and standards that we have. Now, we understand that this is a long-term process. We know this, and we know it will take time. But we still do think that this is the right direction to go into. Now, having said that, we share a lot of these convictions with the US. So, there's many areas, especially also in the rule of law and in the human rights field, where we actually have the same points of view and also do coordinate very well in making them known to our partner governments in the region. Now, I'd like to also say a word about Afghanistan and the linkages with Central Asia. Now, in the region at the moment, of course, there is a lot of concern about what the post-2014 scenario will mean to them. And so there is a lot of requests also that we should enhance programs on border security, and we should, actually strengthen the cooperation with them on these issues. Now, the EU has been active in these areas already for several years. There is a program called Border Management in Central Asia, BOMCA, which has been running. It will now go into its 9th phase. And yes, there is a commitment from our side to stay engaged on that, but I also would like to make a caveat here, because border security from our point of view means integrated border management. And integrated border management means you do the interdiction side, so you control, criminal activity or drug trafficking as far as you can, but you also look at the trade facilitation and the people-to-people contact side. So you actually make your border more open towards actually encouraging these kind of illicit and illegal activities, which actually I think are even more necessary as we now look also at transition in Afghanistan. So to create more linkages, especially also in the border regions on both sides of this critical border, in the positive sense, economic interaction, local trade, cultural exchange, young people meeting each other, it's a key element of this strategy. So it's not only a kind of security and police run issue. The other program that has been active is CADAB, which is about countering narcotics. Okay. And so that's another, there is also an action plan between the EU and Central Asia on drugs. And again, it's not really focused on the police measures, it's more focused on demand reduction and actually how you deal with the drug problem within your own societies. Because Central Asia, of course, has suffered the fate of all transit areas for drug trafficking. Very, soon you end up having, of course, the addiction problem within your own societies, and that is part of what we also want to work on. A final word now on some of the partners. I think that with the US, we share a lot of the main, pillars of our Central Asia approach, and therefore we do coordinate very well also with the US. But of course, We also have regular consultations with the Russian Federation, another, of course, big player with long-standing, of course, position in the region. We also have good contact with Turkey. Turkey, of course, they have their own special relationship, I would say, with Central Asia, and we have our own special relationship with Turkey as the EU, as you are all aware, I'm sure. And so the question is really, how can one, again, you know, use the different approaches, the different leverage that we have positively with the region. And another player that I think should be also, of course, looked at is China, and it's also India. Both, of course, China, if you look at the investment figures, you will find that they are actually on top of the list, engaged very much economically, and so therefore that, of course, is also a very important element. And I know I should probably end here, and then we can go into questions and answers later. Thank you.